Elias Vance's ambition was etched in the lines of his weathered face, a roadmap of deferred dreams and quiet perseverance. He hadn't grown up enchanted by the sleek birds of the sky. His fascination was born from the gritty reality of the desert city he called home, a place where the roar of jets overhead was a constant, mocking reminder of worlds beyond reach. From the cracked porch of his family's small bungalow, Elias would watch them, not with childlike wonder, but with a deep, simmering longing. He didn't just want to command those metal behemoths. He needed to. It was a visceral yearning to transcend the limitations of his circumstances, to carve a path where none seemed to exist, to prove that the horizon wasn't just for others to chase. Welcome, then, to a story not just of resilience, but of revelation forged in crucible of doubt and the quiet reckoning of conscience. Before we delve into Elias's journey, tell me in the comments, where are you reading from? Because this story might just reshape how you perceive not just travel, but the very air we breathe and the silent battles fought in the spaces between. Elias Vance was a late bloomer, aviation-wise. Born and raised in the sprawling, sun-baked city of Mesa Verde, Arizona, nestled uncomfortably close to a bustling regional airport. He'd always been aware of flight, but for him, the planes weren't symbols of escape, but the chasm between aspiration and reality. The ground vibrated with each takeoff, a tremor that resonated in his own chest, a constant pulse of what he felt he was denied. His abuelo, a quiet man whose hands told stories of years spent laboring under the relentless sun, noticed Elias's fixated gaze. Instead of airy encouragements, his abuelo would simply sit beside him, the dry desert wind whipping around them, and share stories of his own youthful dreams that had been grounded by circumstance and the weight of responsibility. Sueño, son, he'd murmur, his voice raspy like desert sand. Dreams are like birds. You have to fight to let them fly. Elias's father, a restless spirit, had chased fortune in distant oil fields, promises whispered on crackling phone lines, rarely kept. His mother, a seamstress with callous fingers and a spirit tougher than mesquite, worked tirelessly, the rhythmic hum of her sewing machine a constant backdrop to Elias's childhood. For young Elias, flight wasn't just about freedom. It was about defying gravity in every sense of the word, rising above the heavy air of expectation and the subtle, unspoken limitations that seemed to cling to him like desert dust. Through school, he was a standout, not in the way the privileged kids were, with their easy confidence and connections. But he was tenacious, a slow burn. He wrestled with math and science, subjects that felt as foreign and complex as the cockpit of a jetliner. He wasn't driven by scholarships, but by a deeper, more primal need to prove something, not to anyone else, but to himself. It wasn't an easy ascent. He enrolled in a community college aviation program, a world away from the polished academies he'd read about. He was older than most, a Latino man in a field still dominated by faces that didn't reflect his own. Doubt wasn't a hum. It was a chorus, sung by the quiet whispers of his own insecurities and the barely veiled skepticism in the eyes of some instructors and classmates. Another one of these late-life changes. He'd overheard once, a dismissive chuckle trailing after. But Elias didn't let the chorus become a cacophony. He studied in the worn-out library, the scent of old paper and desperation thick in the air. He logged hours in a rickety simulator that smelled faintly of stale coffee and unfulfilled ambition, memorizing charts until his vision blurred, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the stubborn ember of his dream. When Elias finally earned his certifications, his sights were set on SkyVista Regional, a budget airline known more for its aggressive expansion than its prestige. With his abuelo's quiet blessing and his mother's pragmatic hope, he applied, venturing into a world that felt both vast and deeply indifferent. Standing in the sterile, brightly lit SkyVista terminal for his initial interview, worn duffel bag at his feet, he felt the weight of years of self-doubt and the sharp sting of past rejections. He saw a few faces like his, and the air hummed with an unspoken language of privilege he hadn't learned. Yet, he carried himself with a quiet dignity, his gaze fixed on the distant tarmac, on the promise of flight. During his simulator assessment, he met Captain Sternwood, a man whose handshake was as cold and precise as his uniform. Sternwood was a legend at SkyVista, known for his impeccable record and his unyielding adherence to protocol. He was also known for his traditional views. Sternwood didn't offer warm encouragement. His gaze was like a laser, dissecting, assessing. "You're older than our usual candidates, Mr. Vance," he'd stated, his tone devoid of inflection. "And your background, community college?" Elias met his gaze, unflinching. "Experience is experience, Captain. And the sky doesn't discriminate based on where you learn to fly." Sternwood's lips tightened, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Skill is what matters," he conceded, grudgingly. "Prove you have it." Elias's mother, pragmatic and grounded, worried about the inherent risks of aviation, the volatile desert weather, the mechanical unknowns. Her texts were a mix of blessings and cautions, punctuated with worried emojis. Elias understood her fear, born from a lifetime of navigating uncertainty. His abuelo, however, offered a different kind of support. He didn't understand the intricacies of flight, but he understood the language of dreams deferred and finally realized. He'd simply gnawed, his eyes the color of faded denim, holding a quiet pride. "Vuela alto, Elias," he'd say. "Fly high." By the time Elias completed Sky Vista's grueling training, he was a first officer, assigned to short-haul routes, the bottom rung of the ladder. The pilot shortage had indeed cracked the door open, but the hallway was still shadowed. His first weeks were a blur of protocols, simulator sessions, and navigating the subtle hierarchies of the crew lounge. Some colleagues, younger, more idealistic, were welcoming, impressed by his quiet competence. Others, veterans like Sternwood, watched him with a guarded suspicion, their smiles thin, their questions edged with doubt. Sternwood, especially, made his discomfort palpable. His instructions were clipped, his critiques sharp, his gaze distant, as if Elias were an unwelcome presence in his domain. Elias tried to remain professional, reminding himself he was there to fly, not to seek approval. A few months into his tenure, Elias was assigned a Mesa Verde to Phoenix Hop, a short, familiar route. The cockpit felt cramped, charged with low-grade tension when he arrived. Sternwood was already there, a rigid silhouette against the pre-dawn light, methodically running through checklists. Elias offered a respectful greeting, but Sternwood barely nodded. As they prepped for takeoff, Elias noticed the subtle digs, the way Sternwood corrected minor procedures with a pointed tone, the way his eyes never quite met Elias's, always glancing away, dismissive. Still, Elias maintained his focus, executing his duties with practiced precision. They landed without incident, the desert landscape stretching out in the dawn light. But after the passengers disembarked, Sternwood turned to Elias, his face tight with barely suppressed anger. "Listen, Vance," he began, his voice low and dangerous. "You're here because they need bodies and seats. Don't mistake that for anything else. Don't think you're special. Don't think you're entitled." The words were like a physical blow, stealing the air from Elias's lungs. He fought to keep his voice steady. "Captain," he replied, his gaze unwavering, "I expect nothing but a fair assessment of my abilities. Nothing more, nothing less." Sternwood scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound, and stalked out of the cockpit, leaving Elias alone in the sudden, suffocating silence. The cockpit, once a symbol of aspiration, now felt like a cage. Subsequent flights with Sternwood followed the same pattern. Subtle jabs, veiled insults, a constant undercurrent of hostility. Sternwood would question his judgment in front of junior flight attendants, dismiss his suggestions during critical phases of flight, his prejudice a cold, persistent wind. Elias endured it, but the strain began to show in the set of his jaw, the weariness in his eyes. His closest friend at Sky Vista, Isabella Izzy Diaz, a flight attendant with a fiery spirit and a keen sense of injustice, noticed a shift. "That fossil giving you trouble again, Mijo?" she asked one evening, her voice laced with concern as they walked through the echoing terminal. Elias hesitated, the ingrained habit of stoicism battling with the need to confide. He finally admitted the subtle, corrosive nature of Sternwood's harassment. Izzy's eyes flashed with righteous anger. "Report him, Elias. HR, don't let him poison you." But Elias was torn. Reporting Sternwood felt like admitting defeat, like validating the very doubts that had shadowed him for years. He was afraid of being labeled as sensitive, as unable to handle the pressure. He resolved to bury himself in his work, to become so undeniably skilled that prejudice would simply wither in the face of his competence. He would outfly the doubt. But a seed of resentment, a bitter taste of disappointment, had taken root. Sky Vista, with its glossy brochures and promises of opportunity, felt less like a meritocracy and more like a carefully constructed facade. Weeks bled into months. Elias accumulated flight hours, navigating routes with a rotating roster captains. Some were professional, curtly polite. Others were more approachable, offering quiet encouragement. But the shadow of Sternwood lingered, a constant reminder of the undercurrent of bias. He found solace in the easy camaraderie with Izzy and in occasional layovers with Captain Reyes, an older, seasoned pilot who had become an unexpected mentor. Reyes, a man of few words, offered practical advice and quiet affirmation. Ojos en el premio, Elias. Reyes had advised during particularly turbulent descent, eyes on the prize, let the noise fade. One challenging flight with Reyes at the helm became a turning point. They navigated a treacherous storm system over the Rockies, requiring split-second decisions and unwavering focus. Elias handled the approach with a cool precision that earned Reyes' rare praise. As they waited for the gate to open, Reyes turned to him, his gaze steady. "You have the instincts, muchacho. Don't let the small minds ground you." Reyes' quiet faith was a lifeline, a reminder that his skill was undeniable, even if his worth was questioned. It kept his own doubts from spiraling. Amidst his personal battles, a deeper unease began to settle in. Elias started noticing subtle anomalies in Sky Vista's operations. Maintenance delays were becoming more frequent, schedules tighter, and hushed whispers circulated among the ground crews about efficiency initiatives that seemed to prioritize speed over thoroughness. Overhearing mechanics grumbling about Band-Aid fixes and pressure to sign off sparked a cold dread in Elias. He came from a culture where rules and procedures were sacred, especially in matters of safety. Any compromise, any corner cut in aviation, felt like a betrayal of trust, a gamble with lives. He tried to voice his concerns casually to other pilots, to crew chiefs, but met with tight-lipped silence, weary shrugs, or the dismissive mantra, "Just fly the plane, Elias." Maintenance handles maintenance. A small, unsettling incident occurred on a pre-dawn flight out of Albuquerque. Elias noticed a slight discrepancy in the oil pressure gauge, a flicker outside the normal range. He brought it to the attention of the captain on that flight. Captain Ramirez, a woman known for her meticulousness. Ramirez, unlike others, didn't dismiss his concern. She ordered a pre-flight inspection, a delay that rippled to the tightly wound schedule. The ground crew discovered a hairline fracture in an oil line, a minor issue, quickly rectified. But the fact that it had been missed during routine checks chilled Elias. It wasn't just about one faulty line. It was about a system that seemed to be fraying at the edges. Elias's growing unease morphed into a quiet, relentless investigation. Driven by a sense of responsibility that transcended his personal ambitions, he began discreetly talking to mechanics during layovers, engaging flight attendants in hushed conversations in empty galleys, observing gate agents juggling increasingly tight turnaround times. He pieced together fragments of information, whispers of corners cut, procedures rushed, morale plummeting under the relentless pressure to optimize. Some spoke openly, their frustration palpable. Others clammed up, fear clouding their eyes, the unspoken threat of corporate reprisal hanging heavy in the air. Elias felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He had a professional obligation to report potential violations, but the ingrained fear of being labeled a troublemaker, a problem employee, gnawed at him. He had already tasted the subtle venom of prejudice. Blowing the whistle felt like painting a target on his back. Around this time, Izzy approached Elias. Her usual vibrant energy dimmed, her voice hushed. Gossip among the flight attendants, she explained, was reaching a fever pitch. Recurring electrical glitches on the older MD-80s, cabin lights flickering erratically, ventilation systems sputtering, minor incidents dismissed as quirks of aging aircraft, were becoming alarmingly frequent. Izzy mentioned a union rep, a woman named Ms. Rodriguez, who was quietly compiling data on these anomalies, hoping to leverage union pressure to force the airline to address the escalating safety concerns. Elias listened, his heart hammering against his ribs. His mind raced, conjuring scenarios of cascading failures, a seemingly minor electrical fault escalating into something catastrophic. As the rumor solidified into a chilling pattern, Elias's unease became a cold certainty. He started meticulously documenting every anomaly, every missed detail, every hushed conversation. He confided in Reyes, carefully, obliquely, seeking guidance without revealing the full scope of his suspicions. Reyes, his gaze unwavering, simply stated, "En este trabajo, Elias, la seguridad es primero, siempre." In this job, Elias, safety comes first. Always. Reyes's words were a quiet thunderclap, reaffirming the moral compass that guided Elias. Moral clarity, Reyes implied, was not optional. It was the very air a pilot breathed. Then came the morning that changed everything. Elias arrived at the Mesa Verde terminal for a flight to Dallas, a routine milk run. He approached the assigned aircraft, a veteran MD-80, and his blood ran cold. The maintenance log was incomplete. A squawk about a faulty stabilizer trim indicator was marked resolved, but there were no mechanic signatures, no final clearance stamps. A gaping hole in the chain of accountability. He queried the ground crew, their faces harried, their responses rushed, dismissive. Departure time loomed, the gate agent's voice echoing through the terminal, announcing boarding. Elias, his gut screaming a silent alarm, pressed the ground crew supervisor, a frazzled man juggling clipboards. Clerical error, pilot. Cleared to fly. Boarding now. The supervisor waved him away, already moving on to the next crisis. Inside the cockpit, the captain assigned to this flight was Sternwood. Elias's stomach clenched. Sternwood was already running to the pre-flight checks, his movements sharp, his gaze fixed, ignoring Elias's arrival as if he were invisible. Elias took his seat, strapped in, his hands clammy. He opened the flight binder, the incomplete maintenance log glaring at him. Summoning a courage he didn't know he possessed, he addressed Sternwood, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "Captain," he began, "the maintenance log for stabilizer trim, it's not finalized. No sign-off. I think we need to get this clarified before takeoff." Sternwood's had snapped up, his eyes, cold and hard, boring into Elias. "We're on a tight schedule, Vance," he snapped, his voice laced with ice. "If it was a real issue, they wouldn't have cleared us. Are you questioning my judgment?" Elias's pulse hammered in his ears. He knew pushing this could ignite Sternwood's already volatile temper, but the thought of not pushing it, of ignoring a gaping hole in protocol, was unthinkable. "Captain," Elias replied, his voice firm, unwavering, "as first officer, it's my responsibility to ensure this aircraft is safe. With all due respect, I suggest we get mechanics sign-off before we move." Sternwood's jaw tightened, his face flushing a dangerous red. "Fine," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "But if this causes a delay, it's on your record, Vance." He stormed out of the cockpit. Phone pressed his ear, leaving Elias alone in the charged silence. 10 agonizing minutes crawled by. Finally, a mechanic, his face etched with weariness, arrived, scribbled a hurried signature in the logbook, mumbled something about paperwork backlog, and vanished. The flight departed late, Sternwood's simmering rage radiating from the left seat. The entire flight was a suffocating tableau of tension. Sternwood's clipped commands, the strained silence from the rest of the crew, the furtive, worried glances from the flight attendants. It all coalesced into a heavy, suffocating atmosphere. Elias felt the weight of his decision, the isolation of standing against the current. He questioned not just Sternwood, but the entire culture of Sky Vista. Could an airline, driven by profit margins and relentless schedules, truly prioritize safety? Could he, one man, stand against that tide? His sense of duty warred with his desire for self-preservation. He had fought so hard to earn his place in the cockpit, but now, the cockpit itself felt compromised. Something larger than his personal career was at stake. Upon landing in Dallas, Sternwood wasted no time. He filed a formal complaint against Elias, accusing him of insubordination, unnecessary delay, and creating a hostile cockpit environment. The flight operations manager at Dallas-Fort Worth, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Alvarez, pulled Elias into a windowless office, the air thick with recycled air and unspoken accusations. "I need your side of this, Mr. Vance," Alvarez stated, her tone neutral, her gaze direct. Elias recounted the events, detail by painstaking detail, presenting the incomplete log as irrefutable evidence. Alvarez listened, her expression unreadable, occasionally scribbling notes on a legal pad. She sighed, rubbing her temples, the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. "All right," she said finally, her voice weary. "Thank you for your thoroughness, Mr. Vance. I'll look into this." But her eyes held a flicker of warning, a silent acknowledgement of the political currents within Sky Vista. "Keep in mind, Captain Sternwood, he has friends in high places." Leaving Alvarez's office, Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He had followed protocol, upheld his duty, but the aftermath felt less like vindication and more like the prelude to a storm. The complaint hung over him, a Damoclean sword suspended by threads of corporate politics. Days turned into a tense, uncertain limbo. Elias continued his flight assignments, each takeoff and landing now carrying a heavier weight of unease. He became hyper-aware of every minor vibration, every unusual sound, every flicker of the cabin lights, anomalies that now seemed less like quirks and more like symptoms of a deeper malaise. Crew members moved with a palpable edginess, their conversations hushed, their smiles strained, alluding to corporate directives and the relentless pressure to keep things moving. The tension reached a breaking point when a leaked internal memo, a carelessly forwarded email, landed in Elias's inbox. The memo, allegedly from a senior executive, instructed ground crews to minimize downtime at all costs, to streamline pre-flight checks, and to prioritize on-time departures. The language was carefully couched in corporate jargon, but the implication was chillingly clear. Efficiency was paramount, even if it meant flirting with the edges of safety. Morale at Sky Vista plummeted. Rumors of cost-cutting measures, of deferred maintenance, of a fleet stretched too thin, spread like wildfire through the crew lounges and whispered conversations in darkened terminals. That same week, Izzy confided in Elias, her voice trembling with barely suppressed anger. 2 of her fellow flight attendants had been disciplined for reporting a faint but persistent fuel odor mid-flight. They had insisted on diverting to the nearest airport, incurring delays and extra fuel costs. Instead of commendation for their vigilance, they received official reprimands for operational disruptions. Hearing this, a cold dread settled in Elias's bones. The pattern was undeniable, the message deafeningly clear. Profit over prudence. Every fiber of his being screamed that this was wrong, that a catastrophe was not just possible, but inevitable, if the culture at Sky Vista didn't fundamentally shift. Desperate, unsure where else to turn, Elias remembered Ms. Rodriguez, the union rep Izzy had mentioned. He tracked her down, a quiet meeting arranged at a bustling coffee shop far from the airport's watchful eyes. Ms. Rodriguez, a woman with a calm demeanor that belied a steely resolve, listened intently as Elias recounted his experiences, the incomplete logs, the dismissed concerns, the pervasive pressure to cut corners. Her expression remained impassive, but her eyes, sharp and intelligent, flickered with a grim recognition. "We've been gathering evidence for months, Mr. Vance," she said, stirring her coffee, her voice low, urgent. "We just needed someone inside, someone from the cockpit, to confirm the pattern. Thank you for coming forward." A flicker of a smile, brief and weary. "But be careful, Piloto. Sky Vista, they don't take kindly to dissent." A wave of relief washed over Elias, mingled with a fresh surge of fear. He wasn't alone, but he had also stepped onto a precarious ledge. Ms. Rodriguez explained the union strategy, escalate the concerns to the FAA, armed with irrefutable evidence, a coordinated, multi-pronged approach. "We need logs, recordings, anything that proves deliberate negligence," she emphasized. Elias nodded, his resolve hardening. He couldn't turn back now, even if it cost him everything. In the days that followed, Elias walked a tightrope. He became a meticulous collector of data, a quiet observer of the subtle cracks in the system. He surreptitiously copied flight logs with discrepancies, meticulously documented every overheard remark from maintenance crews, quietly encouraged other pilots, those he trusted, to report anomalies, to document everything. His small apartment, usually Spartan and functional, transformed into a clandestine documentation center, files stacked precariously on his worn coffee table, scribbled notes covering every surface. His mother, noticing his escalating stress, the dark circles under his eyes, would bring him cafecito, place it beside him, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. "Ten cuidado, mijo," she'd whisper, her voice laced with worry. "Be careful, son." His abuelo, though he didn't fully grasp the technicalities of Elias's struggle, understood the deeper currents of integrity and courage. He'd simply nod, his silence a powerful form of support. During this tumultuous period, Elias flew with a rotating cast of captains. Some grew suspicious of his meticulousness, his insistent questioning of even minor discrepancies. He sensed a subtle hostility from those who valued efficiency above all else, those who saw him as a threat to the smooth operation of the machine. Others, a quiet minority, offered furtive nods of solidarity, their eyes conveying a silent admiration, tinged with fear. They had families to feed, mortgages to pay. They couldn't afford to take a stand, even if their conscience whispered otherwise. And always, in the background, the simmering tension with Sternwood. His complaint against Elias remained unresolved, a sword of Damocles. Sternwood's glares in the crew lounge became colder, more openly contemptuous. The whispers followed Elias, a constant, corrosive undercurrent. Then came the day the dam broke. Elias was scheduled for a transcontinental flight, New York to Los Angeles, Sky Vista's flagship route, a symbol of their ambition, their reach. He arrived at JFK hours early, meticulously reviewing the flight plan, poring over weather charts, his focus laser-sharp. This flight, he knew, had to be perfect. As he approached the gate, he saw a maintenance team hastily exiting the aircraft, their faces grim, their movements rushed. One mechanic, his uniform smudged with grease, paused just long enough to mutter, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "They're making us sign off on a patch job, not a fix." Before Elias could react, another mechanic grabbed his arm, pulling him away, their hushed voices swallowed by the terminals. Then Elias's stomach plummeted. He boarded the aircraft, his senses heightened, every detail amplified. In the cockpit, he found Captain Russell Hayes, a man known for his easygoing demeanor, his unflappable calm. Elias didn't know Hayes well, but he seemed competent enough. They exchanged perfunctory greetings, and Elias immediately opened a logbook. A note about the auxiliary power unit, the APU, caught his eye. Intermittent malfunction. Repaired. The word, repaired, felt flimsy, inadequate. Elias asked Hayes about it, his voice carefully neutral. Hayes shrugged, dismissing his concern with a wave of his hand. "Maintenance says it's fine, Elias. Let's trust them, huh? We're already behind schedule." Passengers began boarding. The rhythmic thump of luggage overhead a counterpoint to the frantic drumming of Elias's heart. He tried to contact ground crew to get clarification on the APU repair, but was met with curt dismissals, clipped reassurances. Cleared. No further action. Boarding complete. Torn between protocol and gut instinct, Elias completed his pre-flight checks, his hands moving mechanically, his mind racing. He noticed subtle anomalies in the engine readings, barely perceptible deviations from a normal range. He mentioned it to Hayes, his voice tight with suppressed anxiety. Hayes, preoccupied with the pre-departure checklist, glanced at the gauges, his brow furrowed briefly, then smoothed out. Within acceptable limits, Elias. "Relax. Let's get this bird in the air." The final boarding call echoed through the cabin. The doors sealed shut with a pressurized hiss. They pushed back from the gate, the taxi and takeoff deceptively smooth, deceptively normal. But once airborne, climbing to the cloud layer, a low, ominous rumble vibrated from the rear of the plane, a deep, unsettling tremor that resonated through the airframe. Flight attendants reported flickering cabin lights. Again. A passenger seated near the back, his voice laced with panic. described a burning smell, acrid and sharp. Elias alerted Hayes, his voice urgent, his gaze fixed on the increasingly erratic instrument readings. Hayes acknowledged the reports, his jovial demeanor finally cracking, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "Let's monitor," he said, his voice strained, less confident now. Moments later, a piercing alarm shrieked through the cockpit, a flashing red light on the instrument panel. Electrical malfunction. APU system failure. Sweat beaded on Elias's forehead. He didn't hesitate. "Captain," he asserted, his voice clear, firm, cutting to the rising panic. "We have an active alarm. Multiple cabin reports. We need to divert. Now. We cannot compromise on safety." A tense silence hung in the cockpit, thick with the weight of indecision. Hayes hesitated, his face a mask of conflict. The operational costs, the potential fallout from management, warring with the stark reality of the flashing alarm and the smell of burning wires. Then, finally, a flicker of understanding, of grim acceptance, in his eyes. He nodded, his voice tight with forced calm. "Agreed, Elias. Divert to Denver." The landing in Denver was a white-knuckle affair, emergency services lining the runway, sirens wailing in the distance, passengers evacuated, shaken but safe. The ensuing chaos unleashed a torrent of inquiries, media frenzy, an FAA investigation launched within hours. That evening, sitting in a sterile debriefing room, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, exhaustion and a fragile sense of relief wore within Elias. The mechanic's whispered warning echoed in his mind. Patch job, not a fix. His convictions hardened into steel. Sky Vista wasn't just cutting corners. They were playing Russian roulette with human lives. And he, Elias Vance, could no longer stand by in silence. In the aftermath, Hayes, scrambling to protect himself, attempted to deflect blame onto maintenance. Maintenance, in turn, pointed fingers at flight operations. Each department, locked in self-preservation, refused to acknowledge the systemic rot. Elias watched the blame game unfold, a grim, predictable tragedy. Meanwhile, FAA investigators descended, demanding documentation, flight logs, communication records. Elias found himself at a moral crossroads. Should he hand over the data he'd painstakingly collected directly to the investigators, or work through Ms. Rodriguez and the union? As initially planned, Ms. Rodriguez called him, her voice urgent. They met in her cramped, rented office, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and simmering resolve. "We have enough to show a pattern, Elias," she stated, her gaze intense. "But we need a pilot, a key witness, someone with cockpit credibility." Elias's chest tightened. This was it. Standing publicly against Sky Vista meant professional suicide, a potential blacklisting within the entire industry. But then, he remembered the fear in the passenger's eyes, the mechanic's whispered confession, Izzy's quiet courage, Reyes's unwavering gaze, the cost of silence. The realization that inaction was a far greater catastrophe solidified his resolve. He looked at Ms. Rodriguez, his voice steady, unwavering. "I'll do it," he said. "I'm willing to speak up. Whatever the fallout." Relief washed over Ms. Rodriguez's face. A brief crack in her professional facade. They began to strategize, to solidify their evidence, to partner with legal counsel specializing in aviation whistleblower cases, to prepare for the inevitable backlash. Ms. Rodriguez's final words that day echoed in Elias's mind. "Sky Vista will retaliate, Elias. Be ready." He understood the risks. But for Elias Vance, the time for tiptoeing around a corrupt system was over. Integrity, he was learning, demanded a price, and he was finally ready to pay it. Word of Elias's cooperation with the investigation spread through the Sky Vista grapevine like wildfire. The subtle hostility morphed into open suspicion, then outright animosity. Pilots he'd once shared casual camaraderie with now avoided his gaze, their conversations abruptly ceasing when he entered the crew lounge. Sternwood's disdain became a public spectacle. In the break room, amidst the clatter of coffee cups and forced laughter, Sternwood confronted him, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you're some kind of hero, Vance," he sneered, his face contorted with rage. "All you're doing is dragging us all down." You want to see this airline go under? Hundreds of jobs lost. Elias met Sternwood's furious gaze, his own voice calm, devoid of emotion. I'd rather see an airline that values safety over profit, Captain. If jobs are lost, that's on the executives who prioritize the bottom line over human lives. Not on me for exposing it. Isolation became Elias's constant companion. He leaned on Izzy's unwavering support, her fiery spirit a constant source of strength. Reyes, too, offered quiet encouragement, his presence a silent affirmation of Elias's choices. One evening, his phone rang, an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. A mechanic, his voice trembling with fear and relief, on the other end. "Mr. Vance," he whispered, I can't live with this anymore. I've seen them skipping steps, forcing us to sign off. I'll testify." Bolstered by these fragile alliances, Elias worked tirelessly with Ms. Rodriguez, meticulously compiling their airtight dossier. Incomplete maintenance logs, rushed sign-offs, internal emails advocating for cost-cutting over safety protocols, testimonies from mechanics, flight attendants, even a few pilots willing to risk everything. Each piece of evidence was a brick in a growing wall of accountability, a testament to the power of collective courage. The day Elias walked into the FAA headquarters, dossier in hand, felt surreal. Standing in the austere government-issue office, his heart pounded against his ribs. But beneath the fear, a profound sense of purpose settled within him. The lead investigator, a stern-faced man with eyes that missed nothing, sifted through the documents, his questions sharp, precise. Beneath his professional composure, Elias glimpsed a flicker of something akin to alarm, a dawning realization of the scale of the negligence he was uncovering. As Elias left the FAA building, the weight on his shoulders lifted, replaced by a fragile, cautious hope. He had done what he had to do. Almost immediately, Sky Vista's legal machinery roared to life. Smear campaigns, whispered rumors, attempts to discredit Elias's character and competence. Sternwood's complaint of insubordination was resurrected, amplified, twisted into a narrative of a disgruntled employee, a rogue pilot. Some staff, desperate to protect their jobs, their livelihoods, paired to the company line, claiming ignorance, denying any knowledge of safety violations. But the carefully constructed illusion shattered as more voices joined Elias's. Mechanics, flight attendants, even a few junior pilots, emboldened by Elias's courage, stepped forward, sharing their own stories, their own evidence. The narrative of a lone malcontent crumbled under the weight of collective testimony. Even as the evidence mounted, Sky Vista's upper echelons remained defiant, issuing carefully crafted statements of denial, praising their unwavering commitment to safety, dismissing the mechanical issues as standard industry challenges. But the investigation deepened, the media scrutiny intensified, the story exploding into a national scandal. Journalists unearthed Sky Vista's dark history. Quiet settlements with whistleblowers, suppressed safety audits, a pattern of prioritizing profit over passenger safety. The story became a national talking point, sparking heated debates about corporate responsibility, regulatory oversight, and the insidious nature of systemic negligence. Amidst the media storm, Elias continued to fly his scheduled routes, his resolve hardened by the firestorm around him. But Sky Vista, in its own subtle, retaliatory ways, began to sideline him. His flight roster dwindled. Desirable routes vanished, replaced by less lucrative, less prestigious assignments. He'd arrive at the crew lounge to find his locker defaced with hateful graffiti, vicious slurs targeting not just his whistleblowing, but his heritage, his very identity.